Eleanor Vance had spent her whole life feeling like a shadow in someone else's story. She believed her heart, so full of quiet love, was a secret the world would never discover. She was so very wrong. The little room under the stairs was always cold, even in the late afternoon sun. Dust motes danced in the thin light that squeezed through the one small window, and they were the only things in the room that seemed to move with any joy. Eleanor Vance sat on the edge of her narrow bed, her mending piled neatly beside her. Each stitch she pulled through the fine fabric of her cousin's dress was careful and precise. It was work that required good eyes and a steady hand, but it asked for nothing of her heart. That was why they gave it to her. From the main part of the house, she could hear the sounds of a family living. The clatter of pots from the kitchen, the laughter of her cousin's children running through the hall, the low murmur of her cousin's husband returning from his work. They were not unkind people. They gave her a roof and food for her work. But she was a piece of furniture in their home, a useful thing that was noticed only when it was not where it was supposed to be. She was a guest who had overstayed her welcome by about 5 years, ever since her own parents had passed away. Eleanor, who everyone called Ellie, believed she was plain. She was too tall for a woman, her hands were rough from washing and sewing, and her voice was too soft to be heard in a noisy room. She had accepted this as her truth. She was like a piece of dry bread on a table full of sweet cakes, useful but never wanted. She finished the last stitch and bit the thread with her teeth. She folded the dress, smoothing its wrinkles with a hand that trembled just a little. She had to take it to her cousin, and that meant walking through the heart of the home, through all that noise and life that did not include her. As she passed the dining room, the children screeched and ran around the table. Her cousin Martha was setting out plates. She looked up as Ellie appeared in the doorway. "Oh, finished already? Good," Martha said, taking the dress without really looking at it. "You are a wonder with a needle, Ellie. So quick. Put it on my bed, will you? And then you can help me with the potatoes for supper." It was always like this. A task finished was immediately replaced by another. There was no thank you, only, and then. Ellie nodded, her eyes on the floor. She did as she was asked, her feet quiet on the stairs. She felt a familiar hollow feeling in her chest. This was her life. This would always be her life. A silent, useful shadow in someone else's bright world. Later that evening, after the supper dishes were washed and the children were put to bed, Ellie sat alone in her little room. The house was finally quiet. She held a single sheet of paper in her hands, reading it for the 10th time. It was an advertisement she had found weeks ago in the newspaper used to wrap the fish from the market. A practical man of good character in the Wyoming Territory seeks a practical woman of good character for matrimony. Object: homemaking and child-rearing. A quiet boy of 5 years is in need of a woman's hand. Please address replies to Thomas Walker, Cedar Ridge. The words were so plain, so simple. They offered no pretty lies about love or companionship. It asked for work. It asked for practicality. 2 things Ellie knew she had in great supply. It was the other part, the child, that made her heart squeeze. A little boy who needed care. For weeks, the paper had been hidden under her mattress. It was a foolish dream, a dangerous idea. But tonight, the hollow feeling was bigger than ever. The sound of the family's laughter echoed in the silence, reminding her of everything she would never have here. Taking a deep breath, she pulled a small writing box from under her bed. She dipped her pen in ink, the nib scratching loudly in the quiet room. What could she say? She could not promise beauty or wit. "Dear Mr. Walker," she wrote, her handwriting neat and careful. "My name is Eleanor Vance. I am 24 years of age. I am strong and in good health. I am very practical. I can cook, clean, sew, and tend a garden. I have experience in caring for children. I have no family here and seek a useful place in the world. If your offer is still open, I would be willing to travel west. Yours sincerely, Eleanor Vance." She did not write that she was lonely. She did not write that her heart ached for a family of her own, for a child to love, for a place to finally belong. She did not write that she was desperate to be wanted. Those were not practical things. She sealed the letter and held it in her hands. It felt like a message thrown into a vast, dark ocean. She was sure it would sink without a trace, just like all her other hopes. But for the first time in a very long time, she had thrown something. And that alone made a tiny, fragile spark light within her. It was the smallest flicker of hope, and she clung to it in the cold, dark silence of her room. The weeks after sending the letter felt longer than all the years that had come before. Ellie went through her days like a clockwork doll, performing her duties with quiet efficiency. But inside, every moment was filled with a nervous hum. Every time the postman came, her heart would leap into her throat, only to sink again when he passed by without a letter for her. She began to believe her message had been lost, or worse, that Mr. Thomas Walker had taken one look at her plain words and thrown them into his fire. Then, one rainy Tuesday it came. Her cousin Martha handed her the envelope with a curious frown. The paper was rough, the handwriting on the front solid and unpracticed. Ellie's fingers trembled as she took it to her room under the stairs. She broke the seal carefully. The letter inside was just as short as her own had been. Miss Vance. Your letter was received. Your qualities are satisfactory. A railway ticket is enclosed. The stagecoach to Cedar Ridge meets the train on Tuesdays. I will meet the stage. T. Walker. That was all. No questions about her, no descriptions of his home, no words about his son. It was a set of instructions. It was a business arrangement. And yet, Ellie clutched the paper to her chest, tears of sheer relief pricking her eyes. He had written back. He had sent for her. Someone, somewhere, had said yes. Telling her cousin was a cold affair. Martha was shocked, then doubtful. Go west? To marry a man you have never met? Ellie, it is not proper. It is not safe. But Ellie saw the truth behind her cousin's words. Martha was not worried for her safety. She was worried about losing her best seamstress and unpaid housemaid. That realization made Ellie's resolve harden into something strong and steady. My mind is made up, Ellie said, her voice firmer than it had ever been within those walls. The journey was long and tiring. The train was loud and smoky, the stagecoach cramped and dusty. Ellie watched the world change outside her window, from green fields and crowded cities to vast, open lands of gold and brown. The sky seemed to grow bigger here, a huge bowl of brilliant blue. It was both terrifying and beautiful. She practiced what she would say to him. Hello, Mr. Walker. I am Eleanor. It is a pleasure to meet you. The words sounded foolish in her head. Finally, the stagecoach driver called out, Cedar Ridge, in a loud, bored voice. Ellie's heart hammered against her ribs. She smoothed down her best dress, the blue one that had been faded by many washes. She adjusted her hat and took a deep breath before stepping down into the dust of the main street. The town was small, just a few wooden buildings lining the wide dirt road. A general store, a blacksmith, a saloon. And there, leaning against a post outside the sheriff's office, was a man. He was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a work-worn shirt and a serious expression. His hat shaded his eyes, but she could see the strong line of his jaw, tight with what looked like tension. This had to be him. He pushed himself off the post and walked toward her. His steps were not hurried. He looked at her, really looked at her, and Ellie felt her face grow warm under his gaze. She waited for him to say something, to smile, to welcome her. He did not. He stopped a few feet away and gave a short nod. Miss Vance. Mr. Walker, she said, her voice coming out as a nervous squeak. She cleared her throat. Yes. Thank you for the ticket. He nodded again, his eyes already moving past her to her small trunk that the driver had set on the ground. That all you have? Yes, sir. Good. It is a long ride to the ranch. He picked up her trunk as if it weighed nothing and placed it in the back of a simple wooden wagon hitched to a single horse. He did not offer to help her up. She gathered her skirts and climbed onto the hard wooden seat beside him. He flicked the reins, and the wagon jolted forward. The silence was heavy. Ellie searched for something to say. "It is very open here," she tried. "It is," he agreed. After another long pause, he pointed with his chin. "That is Miller's farm. His wife runs the general store. That is where you will get supplies." A little further, he gestured again. "Blacksmith. Good man. His prices are fair." He was giving her a tour of her new duties, not her new home. He finally turned to her, his expression unreadable. "The boy is 5. His name is Samuel. He is a good boy. Quiet. He does not speak." Ellie's heart twisted. Not at all. Not a word. Not since his mother passed. Thomas Walker's voice was flat, as if he had practiced saying those words so they would not hurt anymore. "Your room is off the kitchen. You will have your privacy. I expect the house to be kept, meals made, and the boy looked after. We will be married by the preacher in town once you are settled." Ellie stared at her hands clenched in her lap. This was it. This was the transaction. Her work for a roof over her head. She had known it would be like this, but hearing it out loud, in his cold, practical voice, made her feel more alone than she ever had in her cousin's cold house. She had traveled 1,000 miles to be a servant with a wedding ring. The hope that had carried her all this way flickered and nearly went out. The ranch was exactly as she had feared it would be. The house was a simple, sturdy log structure. It was clean, but it felt empty. There were no curtains softening the windows, no rugs on the scrubbed wooden floors. No pretty dishes on the shelves, just plain, functional ones. It was a place for surviving, not for living. Thomas carried her trunk straight to a small, plain room with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a single peg on the wall for a dress. "This is you," he said, setting the trunk down. "Supper is at 6. I will finish with the horses." And just like that, he was gone, leaving her alone in the silent house. Ellie stood in the middle of her new room, hugging herself. She wanted to cry, but she refused to let herself. She had made this choice. She would see it through. She unpacked her few things, hanging her 2 other dresses on the peg. She placed her hairbrush on the washstand. It did not feel like her room. It felt like another place to stay temporarily. A soft sound made her turn around. In the doorway to the kitchen stood a little boy. He had his father's dark, serious eyes and a head of messy brown hair. He was small for 5, holding onto the doorframe with one hand and sucking the thumb of the other. He just stared at her, his eyes wide and unsure. This was Samuel. Ellie's heart melted at the sight of him. All her loneliness and fear faded for a moment. She did not move toward him, not wanting to scare him. She gave him a soft, gentle smile, the first real smile she had felt since arriving. "Hello, Samuel," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "My name is Ellie. It is very nice to meet you." He did not answer. He did not smile back. But he did not run away either. He just watched her. The evening passed slowly. Ellie found the kitchen and managed to put together a simple stew with the vegetables she found. Thomas came in at exactly 6, washed his hands at the pump outside, and sat at the table. Sammy sat in his own small chair, swinging his legs. The meal was eaten in complete silence. The only sounds were the clinking of spoons against bowls. Thomas did not look at her. Sammy stared at his food. Ellie's mind raced. What could she say? Should she compliment her own cooking? Ask about his day? Every thought seemed silly and out of place in this quiet, heavy room. After they finished, Thomas stood. The food was good. "Thank you," he said, his tone formal. He took his bowl to the wash basin. "I will see to the animals for the night." He left again. Ellie began to wash the dishes. She felt a small presence beside her. Sammy had brought his own bowl and cup and held them up to her. She took them from him. "Thank you, Sammy." That is very helpful. A tiny, almost invisible flicker of something crossed his face. It was not a smile, but it was not a frown either. It was something. Then he turned and padded quietly out of the kitchen, back to whatever corner he had been in before. When the kitchen was clean, Ellie retreated to her room. She closed the door and sat on the edge of the hard bed, listening to the absolute silence of the house. There were no family sounds here. No laughter, no talking, no footsteps above. Just the lonesome sound of the wind outside her window. She had thought her room at her cousin's was the loneliest place in the world. She had been wrong. This was lonelier. There, she was a shadow in a busy house. Here, she was a stranger in an empty one. The hope that had flickered during her journey was now completely gone, smothered by the cold, quiet reality of her new life. She was not a bride. She was a hired hand. And as she lay down in the strange bed, she cried silent tears into the rough pillow, wondering what in the world she had done. The morning sun woke Ellie early. For a moment, she was confused by the strange room, the unfamiliar light. Then memory washed over her, heavy and cold. She was here. This was her life now. The house was still silent. She dressed quickly, smoothing her plain work dress. She had a job to do. She may not be a real wife, but she had been hired to keep a house. She would do it well. She found the kitchen and started a fire in the stove, moving quietly so as not to wake anyone. She found flour, salt, and lard, and began to mix biscuit dough. The familiar, rhythmic motion was a comfort. This was something she knew how to do. She was shaping the dough when a small shadow fell across the doorway. Sammy stood there, watching her, his thumb near his mouth. Ellie gave him a small smile. "Good morning, Sammy. Would you like to help me?" She pulled a chair over to the counter. He hesitated for a long moment, then climbed up onto it, his eyes fixed on the dough. Ellie showed him how to press the top of a tin cup into the dough to make circles. She handed him the cup. His small hands were clumsy, but he tried, his brow furrowed in concentration. He did not make a sound, but he stayed by her side. When Thomas came in from his morning chores, he stopped in the doorway. He saw Sammy standing on the chair, covered in a dusting of flour, carefully cutting a biscuit. He saw Ellie guiding his hand, her voice soft and patient. He did not say anything, but he watched for a long moment before clearing his throat. The biscuits were a little lopsided, but no one mentioned it. The silence at breakfast was the same as the night before, but it felt a little less cold. Sammy ate every bite of his crooked biscuit. After Thomas left, Ellie began her work in earnest. She swept the floors until they were clean. She beat the dust out of the rag rugs. She scrubbed the kitchen table until the wood grain showed. She worked not for praise, but for the simple need to keep her hands and mind busy. Sammy followed her from room to room. He did not get in her way. He just watched, a silent little supervisor. When she went outside to pump water, he followed. When she hung the washing on the line, he sat on the back step and watched the sheets flap in the wind. In the afternoon, she found a small patch of earth near the house that had once been a garden. It was overgrown with weeds. She found a rusty trowel and started to pull them out, one by one. The sun was warm on her back. After a while, she felt a presence. Sammy was crouched beside her. He picked up a small stick and began to scratch at the dirt, mimicking her movements. Ellie's heart felt full. She did not tell him to stop. She just kept working, side by side with the quiet little boy. That night, after another silent supper, Thomas did not immediately leave. He looked at the clean floor, the neat kitchen, the pile of mended clothes she had left on a chair. "The house looks good," he said, his voice low. It wasn't warm, but it was an acknowledgement. "It is my job," Ellie replied softly, not looking up from the dish she was drying. He nodded once, then turned and went outside. It was not much. But for the first time, it felt like they were not just two strangers sharing a space. They were, in a very quiet way, beginning to share a life. Days turned into a week. A routine settled over the Walker Ranch. Ellie rose early, cooked, cleaned, and tended to Sammy. Thomas worked from sunup to sundown, his presence a quiet, often distant force in the house. Ellie stopped hoping for conversation from Thomas. Instead, she poured all her gentle attention into Sammy. She found a slate and a piece of chalk in a cupboard and showed him his letters. She would draw a big A in the corner. "That is for apple," she would say, pointing to the fruit in a bowl. Sammy would watch, his eyes following the chalk, but he never tried to write himself. One afternoon, a loud squawking came from the chicken coop. Ellie looked out the window to see the hens flapping in a panic, scattering feathers everywhere. One of them had somehow gotten its foot tangled in a piece of loose wire on the fence and was thrashing wildly. Thomas was nowhere in sight, probably out in the far pasture. Without thinking, Ellie ran outside. Sammy followed, his eyes wide with alarm. The hen was terrified, hurting itself more with every frantic movement. Ellie spoke in a low, calm voice. "It is all right, little one. It is all right." She moved slowly, not wanting to scare it further. She knelt in the dirt, ignoring the mess. Gently, but firmly, she took hold of the hen's wings, holding it still against her body. It clucked in protest. With her other hand, she carefully worked the thin wire free from its scaly foot. It was twisted tight. Sammy crouched next to her, watching every move she made, his little body tense. Finally, the wire came loose. Ellie set the hen down. It shook itself, let out an offended squawk, and hurried away to join the others. The crisis was over. It was then that Ellie looked up and saw Thomas. He was standing by the barn, a bucket in his hand, watching them. He had seen the whole thing. His expression was unreadable. Ellie stood up, brushing the dirt from her skirt, her face flushed. The wire was loose. The hen was stuck, she explained, feeling suddenly foolish, as if she had meddled in his business. He walked over. He looked at the fixed fence, then at the now calm chickens, then at her dirty hands. He did not look angry. He looked surprised. "Thank you," he said, and his voice was different. It was not the flat, polite tone he used to thank her for supper. It was deeper, more genuine. "I have been meaning to fix that. You have a steady hand." It was the closest thing to a compliment he had ever given her. Ellie did not know what to say. She just nodded. That night, as she was reading a story to Sammy from a book she had found, Thomas came in from outside. He stood in the doorway of the main room, listening. Ellie's voice was soft as she read about a brave little engine. Sammy was curled against her side, his head on her arm, listening intently. Thomas did not say anything. He just stood there for a long time, watching them. The look on his face was not the stern, closed-off expression he usually wore. It was something more complicated. Something almost like pain, and something almost like wonder. Then, as if he had been caught doing something he should not, he turned and walked away, his footsteps quiet on the porch. But for a moment, Ellie had seen it. Crack in the ice. And it made something inside her, something she had thought was gone forever, begin to stir again. The days grew shorter, the air turning crisp with the promise of autumn. Ellie's routine was as solid as the walls of the house now. She found a strange sort of peace in her work. The hollow feeling was still there, a constant ache in her chest, but it was becoming familiar, a part of her she had learned to carry. She had given up any dream of Thomas seeing her as anything more than the help. His moments of surprise, like with the chicken, were fleeting. He always returned to his quiet, distant self. He spoke to her only of chores and weather. The wall around him was too high and too thick for her to climb. One evening, it felt worse than usual. Thomas had come in for supper looking more tired and grim than ever. He had barely touched his food, answering her one question about his day with a grunt before falling back into silence. After he finished, he pushed his chair back. "I will be checking the fence line on the north ridge tomorrow. I will be gone before sunup." It was information, not conversation. Then he was gone, the door closing firmly behind him. This was it, Ellie thought. This was her forever. A life of quiet service, of being invisible in a house that was not her home. She was a ghost in her own life. The hope that had flickered so brightly when she first got his letter felt like a cruel joke now. She had been a fool to believe it. She waited until she was sure Sammy was asleep. She needed air. She needed to be alone with her sadness. She slipped out onto the porch steps, wrapping her shawl tightly around her shoulders against the evening chill. The sky was a deep, dark blue, the first stars beginning to twinkle like tiny holes in a vast blanket. The beauty of it made her want to cry. She felt so small underneath it. So completely alone. She sat there for a long time, listening to the sounds of the night, her heart feeling heavier with every breath. What was she doing here? She was not a wife. She was not a mother. She was a paid companion to a silent little boy and his grieving father. The truth was as cold as the step beneath her. A soft sound made her turn. Sammy was standing in the doorway, his nightshirt on, his feet bare. He must have woken up and seen she was gone. He looked small and worried in the dim light. He did not say anything. He never did. He just walked over and sat down next to her on the step, pressing his small body against her side for warmth. He laid his head on her arm. The simple trust in the gesture broke her heart wide open. She put her arm around him, pulling him close, resting her cheek on his soft hair. She would miss this. She would miss him so much. She held him, thinking of the long journey back east, of the cold room under her cousin's stairs. She was saying a silent goodbye to the only thing that had made this place feel warm. It was then that Sammy lifted his head. He looked up at her, his face pale in the starlight. His eyes were serious, filled with a hope so fragile it made Ellie's breath catch. He opened his mouth, and for a second, nothing came out. Then, in the smallest, softest, most hopeful whisper she had ever heard, a sound meant only for her, he spoke. "Can you be my mommy?" The world stopped. The words hung in the cool night air, so quiet and yet so powerful they seemed to silence the crickets. Ellie stared down at him, her heart swelling until she thought it would burst. It was not a rejection. It was the most beautiful, wanted, needed question she had ever been asked. Tears she could no longer hold back spilled down her cheeks. They were not tears of sadness, but of a joy so profound it felt like healing. She hugged him tightly, burying her face in his hair. "Yes, Sammy," she whispered back, her voice thick with emotion. "Oh, yes. I would like that more than anything in the whole world." Everything changed after the whisper. When Ellie woke the next morning, the world looked different. The sun seemed brighter. The air smelled sweeter. The hollow ache in her chest was gone, filled to the brim with a new and powerful purpose. Thomas Walker may not want a wife, but his son wanted a mother. And Ellie was going to be the best mother she could possibly be. She got out of bed with a new energy. She was not just keeping house for a stern man. She was making a home for her son. She went into the main room and opened the curtains wide, letting the morning sun flood in. Sammy came out, rubbing his eyes. She smiled at him, a real, bright, happy smile. "Good morning, my sweet boy," she said, and his eyes lit up in response. While the oatmeal cooked, she found an old glass jar on a shelf. She went outside and picked a few late-blooming wildflowers, purple and yellow, and put them in the jar with some water. She set it in the middle of the kitchen table. It was a small thing, a spot of color and life in the plain room. When Thomas came in from his early morning chores, he stopped. His eyes went to the jar of flowers on his table. He looked at them for a long moment, a confused frown on his face, as if he could not understand what they were doing there. Then his eyes moved to Ellie. She was humming softly as she stirred the oatmeal, her back straight, her movements sure. She turned and smiled at him. "Breakfast is ready." It was not the shy, hesitant smile he was used to. It was warm and confident. Thomas looked startled. He just nodded and sat down. The change in Ellie was everywhere. She started singing songs while she worked. She asked Sammy to help her bake cookies, and they made a happy mess of the kitchen. She found some old fabric and began stitching it into curtains for the windows. The house, for the first time, was filled with sound and movement and life. The biggest change was in Sammy. He began to smile. Real, true smiles that reached his eyes. He laughed silently when she tickled him. He held her hand when they walked outside. He was still quiet, but his silence was no longer sad. It was a peaceful, watchful silence. He was blooming right in front of his father's eyes. Thomas watched it all happen. He was like a man standing on the outside of a warm, bright room, looking in through a window. He saw the way his son looked at Ellie, with pure love and trust. He saw the way she cared for him, not as a duty, but with a joyful heart. He began to stay in the house a little longer after meals. He would linger by the doorway, watching Ellie read to Sammy, or help him with his letters on the slate. The stern, closed-off look on his face began to soften, replaced by that same look of pained wonder Ellie had seen before. He was seeing what his home could be. He was seeing what he had almost lost by building walls around his heart. And for the first time, he looked not just surprised, but truly sorry. The change in the weather was sudden and fierce. One moment the autumn sky was a clear, pale blue, the next it was choked with bruised purple and gray clouds. A cold wind whipped across the land, tearing the last of the golden leaves from the trees and hurling them against the house. Thomas came in from the yard, his hat pulled low. "Big storm coming," he said, his voice tense. "A real one. I need to secure the barn and make sure the animals are settled." He looked at Ellie, and for the first time, his look was not one of giving orders, but of shared concern. "Keep Sammy inside. It is going to get bad." Ellie nodded, her own nerves tightening. She watched from the window as the wind grew stronger, bending the trees nearly double. The first drops of rain were heavy and cold, smacking against the glass like stones. Soon, it was not just rain. It was a wall of water, turning the yard into a muddy river. The wind howled around the corners of the house, a lonely, terrifying sound. Sammy was frightened. He stuck close to Ellie's side, his small face pale. She built up the fire in the stove and tried to read to him, but neither of them could concentrate. The storm was too loud, too angry. Suddenly, a tremendous cracking sound echoed over the wind, followed by a crash that shook the very foundations of the house. Sammy jumped, his eyes wide with terror. Ellie ran to the window. One of the big old trees in the yard had split under the force of the wind. A large branch had torn loose and crashed down onto the chicken coop, smashing part of the roof. Through the sheets of rain, she saw Thomas sprint from the barn toward the damaged coop. The chickens were scattering in a panic into the storm. He was trying to herd them back, his movements frantic against the blinding rain. Ellie did not stop to think. She turned to Sammy. "Stay right here. Do not move. I have to help your father." She grabbed her shawl and ran out into the storm. The wind and rain hit her like a physical force, soaking her through in an instant. Her hair whipped across her face. She ignored it. She ran to the coop, her boots sinking in the mud. Thomas was trying to lift the heavy branch alone, his muscles straining. "Let me help," she yelled over the wind. "Get back inside," he shouted back, but Ellie was already there. She found a place to grip the wet, rough wood and pushed with all her might. Together, they managed to heave the branch aside just enough. Thomas quickly counted the terrified birds, shooing the ones that had escaped back into the undamaged part of the coop. The crisis was over as quickly as it began. They were both drenched, breathing heavily, standing in the pouring rain. Thomas looked at Ellie, water streaming down his face. Her dress was plastered to her hair a mess, her cheeks red from the cold. She looked nothing like the prim, practical woman who had stepped off the stagecoach. She looked strong. She looked capable. She looked like she belonged right there, standing with him in the storm. He did not say thank you. He did not need to. The look in his eyes said everything. The wall between them, built of grief and silence, seemed to wash away in that downpour. They turned to go back to the house, but then a new fear gripped Ellie. "Sammy!" she cried. They ran inside, dripping water all over the clean floor. The main room was empty. "Sammy!" Ellie called, her heart leaping into her throat. A small sound came from his bedroom. They found him curled up under his bed, shaking like a leaf. He was scared, but he was safe. He had done what she asked. He had not moved. Thomas knelt down, his big, wet frame filling the space. He reached out a hand and gently touched his son's knee. "It is all right, son. The storm is passing. You are safe." Ellie knelt too, her voice soft. "We are both here, Sammy. Everything is all right." Sammy looked from his father's worried face to Ellie's kind one. Slowly, he uncurled himself and crawled out, launching himself into Ellie's arms. She held him close, rocking him gently. Thomas stayed kneeling, watching them, his own fear melting into a look of overwhelming gratitude and something else, something much deeper. The days after the storm were quiet and calm. The sun returned, warmer than before, as if apologizing for its absence. The air smelled of wet earth and clean beginnings. Thomas was different. He was quieter, but it was not the old, closed-off silence. It was a thoughtful quiet. He helped Ellie clean up the mud tracked into the house without being asked. He sat with Sammy for longer periods, just watching him play. He looked at Ellie, really looked at her, and it made her feel seen in a way she never had before. One evening, after Sammy was tucked into bed, Ellie was mending a tear in Thomas's work shirt by the light of the oil lamp. Thomas was sitting in his chair across from her, not reading, not whittling, just sitting. The silence between them was comfortable, not empty. "Ellie," he said, his voice low and serious. She looked up from her sewing. "Yes, Thomas." He took a deep breath, as if gathering courage. "I owe you an apology. A big one." Ellie put her mending down in her lap, her heart beginning to beat a little faster. "I was cold to you when you arrived," he said, his eyes fixed on his hands. I was afraid. I lost Sammy's mother, and the pain of it near broke me. I thought if I never let anyone else in, I could never feel that hurt again. I told myself I just needed a housekeeper. I told myself it was better for Sammy that way." He finally looked up at her, and his eyes were full of a raw honesty that made her want to cry. "I was a fool." He stood up and walked over to kneel in front of her chair, so they were eye to eye. It was a humble gesture that shook Ellie to her core. "You have given my son his laughter back," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You have given this house its heart. You have shown me what real strength looks like. Not just physical strength, but strength of heart. You came here all alone, to a man who gave you nothing but coldness, and you built a home anyway." He reached out and took one of her work-roughened hands in both of his. His hands were warm and strong. "I did not know what I was asking for when I sent that letter," he whispered. "But I know now. I was not asking for a housekeeper. I was asking for you. I was asking for a woman brave enough to love a broken man and his quiet son. I was asking for a partner, a wife, a mother for my boy." He looked into her eyes, his own shining in the lamplight. "Eleanor Vance, I know I do not deserve you. But would you do me the greatest honor in the world? Would you please be my true wife? Would you let us be a real family?" Tears of joy streamed down Ellie's face. This was everything she had ever wanted, everything she had been too afraid to hope for. She saw the love in his eyes, not just for the mother she was to Sammy, but for the woman she was. She was not plain. She was not unwanted. She was loved. She squeezed his hands, her voice clear and sure. "Yes, Thomas. Yes, I will." The wedding was nothing like the grand affairs Ellie had read about in storybooks. It was simple, and it was perfect. It was held right there on the ranch, under the vast blue sky that had witnessed their slow and careful journey to each other. The town preacher came out, and a few neighbors stood by, smiling warmly. Ellie wore her best dress, the faded blue one she had arrived in, but now it felt like a gown fit for a queen. Thomas stood tall and straight in his clean Sunday clothes, his eyes never leaving her face. And between them, holding each of their hands tightly, was Sammy. He was not silent today. He beamed, a bright, sunny smile that showed every one of his small teeth. He kept looking up at Ellie, his eyes shining with a happiness so pure it made her heart feel too big for her chest. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, Thomas leaned down and kissed her. It was not a dramatic kiss, but a soft promise of a kiss. A kiss that said hello and forever all at once. Sammy giggled and squeezed their hands. After the neighbors left, the new family stood together in the yard. The sun was warm on their faces. Thomas put his arm around Ellie's shoulders, pulling her close to his side. Sammy wrapped his arms around her legs in a happy hug. "Welcome home, Mrs. Walker," Thomas said, his voice deep and full of a love she could finally hear. Ellie looked around, at the sturdy house she had filled with warmth, at the man who had learned to love her, at the little boy who had first taught her how to be loved. This was not just a place to live. It was not just a roof over her head. It was her home. She had built it not with boards and nails, but with patience, with kindness, and with a heart brave enough to hope. She was Eleanor Walker. She was a wife. She was a mother. She was wanted. And she was, finally, completely, and joyfully, home. Did you enjoy following Ellie's journey to find her family? If this story warmed your heart, please let us know by leaving a like. For more tender tales of love and new beginnings, remember to subscribe.